Hello, everyone, welcome to my channel. The reason why I recorded this video is to respond to an article published in Lian He Zhao Bao by Wang Fei Ling, a professor of Georgia Tech University. I had originally submitted a rebuttal to Professor Wang's article to the Morning Post, but it was not accepted. As for Lian He Zhao Bao, I am actually a loyal fan of Zhao Bao. I have used it for many years. It has become a reliable source for me to observe the world and obtain first-hand information. Although I disagree with some authors' opinions and comments, I have never wanted to submit an article to refute an author's argument. But ever since I read the work of Professor Wang Fei Ling from Georgia Institute of Technology in the United States, my homeland is where my heart is at peace, a correct view of patriotism for overseas Chinese, I have felt like I have something stuck in my throat and cannot express myself without speaking out. I quote the core proposition of Professor Wang's article as follows: patriotic common sense such as only by helping the motherland become strong can overseas Chinese be better is nothing but propaganda and myths, which are neither logical nor factual. In Professor Wang's eyes, most of the common knowledge of overseas Chinese is just propaganda and myths, which are neither logical nor true. Only Professor Wang is sober and discerning. Is it really the case? On May 6, 1882, the U.S. Congress passed the first law in American history to restrict foreign immigration, the law for the enforcement of the provisions of the treaty relating to Chinese persons, known as the Chinese Exclusion Act. Chinese were unqualified to become U.S. citizens. Before that, about 100,000 Chinese workers participated in the construction of the Western Railway in the United States, and more than 15,000 Chinese workers died on the railway line. They made great contributions to the development of the United States. Although the Chinese community had been protesting against the persecution of overseas Chinese by the United States since 1876, due to the corruption and incompetence of the Qing government, China was at its lowest point in national strength in modern times. The United States government not only ignored it, but also pressured the Qing government to sign a treaty in 1884, banning Chinese workers from going to the United States for 10 years. This treaty marked the Qing government's recognition of the legitimacy of the United States Anti-Chinese Act, making the United States government feel that China was weak and vulnerable, and the anti-Chinese law became more unscrupulous. Until 1948, 3 years after the founding of New China, the prohibition of marriage between Chinese and whites was abolished in California. However, in other states, similar laws were still in force, until the United States Supreme Court unanimously ruled in 1967 that the bill banning interracial marriage was unconstitutional. Let's take a look at the history of anti-Chinese sentiment in other countries. After Vietnam achieved reunification in 1975, it began to align itself with the Soviet Union, and Sino-Vietnamese relations gradually deteriorated. At that time, the Sino-Soviet relations broke down, and the Soviet Union stationed 1 million troops on the northern border of China. In order to curry favor with the Soviet Union, Vietnam not only brazenly sided with the Soviet Union, but also began a large-scale anti-Chinese campaign. Many Chinese have lived in Vietnam for several generations, but the Vietnamese government did not even remember the help that China once gave to Vietnam, and it expelled Chinese and overseas Chinese by all means. The property that local Chinese and overseas Chinese had worked hard for generations was confiscated and occupied. In response to Vietnam's anti-Chinese activities, China proposed negotiations between the two governments on the issue of overseas Chinese in 1978. After the negotiations failed, the Chinese Overseas Chinese Affairs Commission decided to send ships to Vietnam to bring back overseas Chinese. Since then, overseas Chinese in Vietnam have returned home and lived in peace and contentment for nearly half a century. I ask, if one day China and the United States are in a fierce competition and are about to show their cards, and the United States introduces a new Chinese Exclusion Act, and the Chinese government is ready to accept the return of Chinese Americans and overseas Chinese to resettle, where will Professor Wang be at that time? Will he be willing to return to his country of origin, or will he be willing to live in a concentration camp like the Japanese expatriates in World War II? Many people may think that this situation is unlikely to happen, but the fact is that on April 14, 2023, the state of Florida in the United States passed legislation to ban Chinese people from buying houses, and those who have already bought will also be liquidated. Shortly afterwards, the new bill HB 537 in Louisiana also banned Chinese citizens from China and Hong Kong Special Administrative Region from buying, leasing or otherwise acquiring real estate such as houses and land. Since COVID-19, the discrimination and exclusion against Chinese in the American society have become increasingly fierce. Who can guarantee that these bills will not be extended to Chinese who have become U.S. citizens and overseas Chinese with green cards? It is undeniable that emigrating to a foreign country and becoming a citizen of that country naturally requires allegiance to the country of origin in law. However, this does not mean that when the country of origin is strong, it is better for immigrants to safeguard their own interests, which is a common-sense judgment that is wrong. It is a myth, illogical and untrue. On September 16, 2015, a pro-government team in Malaysia organized a rally with the aim of safeguarding the dignity of Malays and shouted the slogan "Long live the Malays." The posters displayed pictures of Malays holding knives and beheading the participants of the Bersih election, and wrote "Chinese participating in the Bersih election, prepare to shed blood." The rally was held in the Chinatown where the Chinese in Kuala Lumpur gathered. For a time, the Chinese in Malaysia can be said to be panic-stricken. The turning point came on September 25 when Huang Huikong, the Chinese ambassador to Malaysia, made a special trip to Chinatown to visit Chinese merchants and publicly stated to the media, "China does not interfere in the internal affairs of other countries, but it will never sit idly by for illegal actions that infringe upon China's national interests, violate the legitimate rights and interests of Chinese citizens and enterprises, and damage the friendly relations between China and the host country." In his speech at the China-Malaysia Forum on the Maritime Silk Road on September 28, Ambassador Huang said, "I reiterate once again that no matter where overseas Chinese go, no matter how many generations they continue, China will always be your warm hometown." Since then, the wave of anti-Chinese sentiment in Malaysia has subsided. Looking at this example, can we still say that the honor and disgrace of overseas Chinese have nothing to do with their country of origin? Let us look at the miserable situation of the Chinese during the anti-Chinese period in history. With the past in mind, how can we have peace of mind when we cannot even ensure our own safety? After emigrating, shouldn't overseas Chinese consider how to avoid being infected with converts mania, correctly handle the relationship between the country of origin and the country of current residence, and make good use of their role as a bridge between the two countries to contribute to the promotion of official or non-official relations between the two countries? Even from the perspective of pure self-interest, maintaining contact with your country of origin after emigrating means that even in the event of unforeseen disasters, you still have an additional path to choose as a diaspora. It means that you have the opportunity to gain insight into the strengths and weaknesses of both countries and societies, and it means that you can better grasp opportunities in both your country of origin and your country of residence. Isn't it? Do we have to require all immigrants to consciously sever ties with their motherland and no longer recognize their ancestors, but instead trace themselves back to the descendants of immigrants from East Africa? People who uphold common sense and simple feelings for their homeland are instead considered by Professor Wang to have degenerated into a false consciousness tinged with racism? Isn't it ridiculous? What do you think? Please leave your comments to let us know. If you like this content, please subscribe to our channel, like and share it. Thank you.